There are bass players who support songs, and then there are bass players who define entire generations. Musicians whose grooves become so powerful, so infectious, and so timeless that their bass lines continue living decades after they were recorded. Bernard Edwards was one of those musicians. If you've ever danced to disco, if you've ever listened to funk, if you've ever heard hip-hop, pop, R&B, electronic music, or modern dance music, then you have already felt the impact of Bernard Edwards, because his grooves didn't simply accompany songs, they became the songs. With his deep pocket, melodic bass lines, and hypnotic rhythmic feel, Edwards helped transform Chic into one of the most influential bands in music history, while simultaneously reshaping the role of bass guitar in popular music forever. But Bernard Edwards wasn't simply a bassist. He was also a songwriter, producer, arranger, visionary, and musical architect whose influence still echoes through modern music today. This is the story of the man who created the groove behind an entire era. This is the story of Bernard Edwards. Before we continue, subscribe now, like this video, comment, and share. Bernard Edwards was born on October 31st, 1952, in Greenville, North Carolina, but he was raised primarily in Brooklyn, New York, during a period when soul music, funk, jazz, and rhythm and blues were exploding throughout urban America. Growing up in Brooklyn during the 1960s exposed him to an incredibly rich musical environment where street culture, gospel churches, Motown records, jazz clubs, and radio hits blended together into one giant soundtrack of creativity. Unlike many future bass legends who came from privileged musical educations, Bernard's musical journey developed through experience, instinct, and relentless listening. He initially played guitar before eventually gravitating toward bass, an instrument that immediately connected with his natural rhythmic sensibility. And that rhythmic sensibility would eventually become one of the greatest in modern music history. Friends and collaborators later described Bernard as someone who possessed a deep internal groove, a musician capable of making even the simplest bass line feel alive, elegant, and irresistibly danceable. What made him unique wasn't flashy virtuosity. It was feel, timing, touch, space, the ability to make people move without overwhelming the song. And during the early 1970s, destiny introduced him to another young musician who shared a similar vision, a guitarist named Nile Rodgers. The meeting between Bernard Edwards and Nile Rodgers would become one of the most important musical partnerships in modern music history. The two musicians met while working as touring musicians in New York City during the early 1970s, eventually performing together in a band called the Big Apple Band. At the time, New York nightlife was evolving rapidly. Disco clubs were becoming cultural centers. DJs were extending dance tracks. And audiences were demanding grooves that could keep dance floors moving all night long. Bernard and Nile recognized something important. Dance music could be sophisticated. It could combine funk, jazz harmony, pop structure, and rhythmic precision while still remaining accessible to mainstream audiences. Inspired by artists like James Brown, Sly Stone, Roxy Music, and the dance culture of clubs such as Studio 54, they formed a new group in 1976. That group was Chic, and within only a few years, they would change popular music forever. From the beginning, CIIC was designed differently from most bands of the era. Bernard Edwards and Nile Rodgers approached music almost like filmmakers designing scenes. Every groove had purpose. Every instrument had space. Every rhythm had intention. Bernard's bass became the foundation of the band's identity. While Nile Rodgers created sharp, rhythmic guitar patterns, Bernard filled the low end with melodic bass lines that moved like living organisms beneath the music. Unlike many disco bass players who relied heavily on repetitive root notes, Bernard constructed bass lines with movement, syncopation, passing tones, octave jumps, and subtle rhythmic variations. His playing was hypnotic, precise, and deeply musical. Then in 1977, Chic released the song that introduced them to the world. Dance, Dance, Dance. Yosa, Yosa, Yosa. The record became a major hit, but the true explosion was still coming. In 1978, Bernard Edwards and Nile Rodgers experienced a moment of frustration that unexpectedly changed music history. According to Nile Rodgers, the two musicians were denied entry into Studio 54 despite being invited to a party for Grace Jones. Angry and irritated, they returned home and began jamming. Out of that frustration emerged one of the most famous grooves ever written, Le Freak. Originally, the chorus lyric was reportedly far more explicit, but eventually it evolved into the iconic phrase, "Freak out." The song exploded globally. Le Freak became one of Atlantic Records' biggest-selling singles ever and transformed Chic into international superstars. At the center of the song sat Bernard Edwards' bass line, tight, funky, economical, and impossible to ignore. The groove demonstrated one of Bernard's greatest gifts. He understood exactly how much to play. Never too much, never too little. Only what the groove needed. And that philosophy would soon create, perhaps, the most influential bass line in modern history. In 1979, Chic released Good Times. What happened next would permanently alter the trajectory of funk, disco, hip-hop, and popular music itself. The bass line Bernard Edwards created for Good Times became one of the most sampled, studied, copied, and celebrated grooves in music history. The line was deceptively simple, but within that simplicity lived extraordinary rhythmic sophistication. The groove danced around the beat with perfect balance between repetition and movement. Every note felt intentional. Every rest mattered. Every accent pushed the song forward. Then something historic happened. In the same year, the Sugar Hill Gang released Rapper's Delight, one of the earliest commercially successful hip-hop records. The track borrowed heavily from the groove of Good Times. This moment became one of the foundational bridges between disco, funk, and hip-hop. In many ways, Bernard Edwards helped lay the rhythmic foundation for modern rap music. His bass line became part of hip-hop DNA. And decades later, musicians still study Good Times as one of the greatest bass performances ever recorded. So what exactly made Bernard Edwards such a revolutionary bassist? The answer wasn't speed, it wasn't technical flash, it was groove architecture. Bernard understood how bass interacts with drums on a psychological level. His lines locked perfectly with kick drums while simultaneously creating melodic counterpoint against guitars and vocals. He often used syncopation, ghost notes, octave displacement, chromatic passing tones, rhythmic anticipation, but perhaps most importantly, he understood space. Bernard knew silence was part of groove. By leaving carefully placed gaps in his bass lines, he allowed the rhythm to breathe. That breathing sensation is one reason his grooves still feel alive decades later. Bass players around the world continue analyzing his timing because his feel is extraordinarily difficult to imitate. Many musicians can copy the notes. Very few can replicate the groove. As Chic became one of the biggest acts of the late 1970s, Bernard Edwards and Nile Rodgers expanded beyond their own band. Soon, they became elite producers and songwriters, and their influence exploded across the music industry. They worked with Diana Ross, David Bowie, Madonna, Debbie Harry, Duran, Sister Sledge. Their production work on Diana Ross's album, Diana produced classics like Upside Down, I'm Coming Out. Again, Bernard's bass lines became central elements of the songs. His grooves didn't simply support the productions, they drove them. Artists quickly realized that hiring Bernard Edwards and Nile Rodgers meant acquiring not only hit songs, but timeless grooves. Part of Bernard Edwards' magic came from his unmistakable bass tone. He became strongly associated with the Music Man's Stingray bass. An instrument whose punchy attack and deep low end perfectly complemented his playing style. His tone was warm, articulate, round, percussive, deeply present in the mix. Unlike many bassists who buried themselves beneath the arrangement, Bernard's bass was designed to be heard clearly. And because Chic arrangements often left intentional space, his bass lines became almost melodic hooks themselves. Many listeners could sing Bernard's bass lines as easily as the vocal melodies. That is extraordinarily rare. Behind the legendary grooves was a musician deeply committed to excellence. Collaborators often described Bernard as meticulous, disciplined, and intensely musical. He cared deeply about feel and precision, but he also possessed warmth and humor. His chemistry with Nile Rodgers became one of the defining creative partnerships of the era, because both musicians balanced each other perfectly. Nile brought rhythmic sharpness and conceptual vision. Bernard brought emotional groove and musical depth. Together, they created something larger than either could have achieved alone. The influence of Bernard Edwards extends far beyond disco. His grooves helped shape funk R&B, hip-hop, pop house music, electronic dance music. Artists from Daft Punk to modern funk revival bands continue drawing inspiration from his work. In fact, Daft Punk's global hit, Get Lucky, intentionally referenced the rhythmic elegance and groove philosophy pioneered by Chic. Modern producers still sample Bernard's bass lines because they remain timeless, alive, human, musical, and impossible to fake. In 1996, Chic reunited for a tour in Japan. Despite years away from the spotlight, audiences still loved the music. The grooves remained timeless. But tragedy struck unexpectedly. On April 18, 1996, Bernard Edwards died in Tokyo at only 43 years old after developing pneumonia following flu-like symptoms. The music world was shocked. One of the greatest groove architects in history was suddenly gone. Yet even in death, Bernard's influence continued growing. Because truly, great grooves never disappear. They simply continue moving through generations. Today, Bernard Edwards is recognized as one of the most influential bass players in modern music history. His bass lines continue inspiring. funk musicians, jazz players, pop producers, hip-hop artists, electronic music creators, and bassists around the world. The genius of Bernard Edwards wasn't about complexity. It was about feel, about making people move emotionally and physically at the same time. He understood that groove is more than rhythm. Groove is emotion, connection, energy. And decades later, the bass lines of Bernard Edwards still fill dance floors around the world, still inspire musicians, still define what great groove feels like. Because Bernard Edwards didn't just play bass, he changed the heartbeat of modern music itself. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. See you in the next video.